In the harsh winter of 1842, deep in the untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a young woman named Eleanor finds herself married to Apache, a charming but secretly cruel frontiersman. What began as a promise of love and adventure quickly turns into a nightmare when Apache, driven by greed and a dark secret involving another woman and a hidden fortune, decides his wife has become an inconvenient burden. During a hunting expedition, he leads Eleanor deep into the most dangerous part of the forest, where wolves howl and no settler dares to venture, and abandons her to die. Injured, freezing, and utterly alone, Eleanor's desperate fight for survival takes an impossible turn when she encounters something that shouldn't exist. A massive, gentle creature the local tribes whisper about in their legends. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and an unexpected bond that defies everything Eleanor thought she knew about monsters, both human and otherwise. The morning Apache told Eleanor they were going on a special hunting trip. She should have noticed the coldness behind his smile, but love has a way of making us blind to the truth, staring us in the face. She stood in their small log cabin, watching her husband of 3 years pack supplies with unusual thoroughness, his dark eyes avoiding hers as he shoved dried meat and rope into his leather satchel. The November wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Apache had been different lately, distant in ways that made her heart ache with questions she was too afraid to ask. The man who once recited poetry to her under the stars now barely spoke during their evening meals, and when he did touch her, his hands felt mechanical, obligatory, as if he were performing a duty rather than expressing affection. "Apache, darling, are you certain we should go today?" Eleanor asked softly, tucking a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear. "The sky looks threatening, and old Thomas at the trading post said a storm is coming from the north." She was 27 years old, with green eyes that her mother once said could see right through to a person's soul, though lately she wondered if that gift had abandoned her when she needed it most. Apache turned to face her, and for just a moment something flickered across his handsome features. Was it guilt or perhaps irritation at her questioning him? "Eleanor, my sweet wife, you worry too much," he said, his voice smooth as honey but somehow lacking warmth. "This is the perfect time to hunt. The deer are moving before the storm, and we need the meat for winter. Besides, I found a spot 3 days ago that's teeming with game. Absolutely teeming. We'll be back before nightfall, I promise." He walked over to her and placed his hands on her shoulders, but his grip was firm, almost too firm, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with an inexplicable dread. "Trust me, Eleanor. When have I ever let you down?" The question hung in the air between them, and Eleanor wanted to say that he'd let her down in countless small ways over the past 6 months. In his forgotten promises and late-night absences, he explained away with vague excuses about checking traps or meeting with traders. But she swallowed her doubts, because that's what women did in 1842. They trusted their husbands, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. "Of course I trust you," she whispered, and Apache's smile widened, though it never quite reached his eyes. Within the hour, they were mounted on their horses, Eleanor's mare following obediently behind Apache's stallion. As they headed into the dense forest that stretched endlessly beyond their settlement, the trees seemed to close in around them as they rode deeper into territory Eleanor didn't recognize, the familiar paths giving way to wilderness that felt ancient and unwelcoming. Apache led them with confident determination, never pausing to mark their trail or check his bearings, and when Eleanor suggested they should leave markers to find their way back, he laughed and told her she was being childish. "I know these woods like the back of my hand, Eleanor. Every tree, every stream. You really must stop questioning me at every turn." His tone carried an edge of annoyance that made her fall silent, focusing instead on the rhythm of her horse's hooves against the frozen ground. The forest was eerily quiet, with no birdsong or rustle of small animals. as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. They rode for hours, and Eleanor's unease grew with each passing mile. The sun, what little of it penetrated the thick canopy, had moved considerably across the sky, and she realized they were heading west, away from their cabin, rather than toward the eastern hunting grounds Apache usually favored. When she mentioned this observation, Apache's jaw tightened visibly. "The game has moved, Eleanor. Animals don't stay in one place forever. Must you question every single decision I make?" "It's exhausting, truly exhausting." His words stung, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away, telling herself that Apache was under stress, that providing for them was difficult, that she needed to be more understanding and less demanding. By mid-afternoon, they reached a clearing that felt wrong in ways Eleanor couldn't articulate. The trees here were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the grey sky like desperate fingers, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves that muffled every sound. Apache dismounted and began unpacking, his movements quick and efficient, and when Eleanor slid down from her mare, her legs trembled from the long ride, and from something else, some primal warning her body was trying to send her brain. "We'll set up camp here," Apache announced, not looking at her. "The hunting spot is just beyond that ridge. We'll rest a moment, then go after the deer." Eleanor helped him unload the supplies, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged their blankets and food. She tried to make conversation, asking Apache about his plans for the winter, about whether they might visit her sister in the spring, about anything that might bridge the growing chasm between them. But his responses were curt, distracted, and finally he told her sharply to stop chattering because she was giving him a headache. The words hit her like a physical blow, and Eleanor retreated into hurt silence, occupying herself with gathering kindling for a fire they wouldn't need, since Apache said they'd be home before dark. But she gathered it anyway, needing something to do with her hands, some way to avoid looking at the stranger her husband had become. When Apache said it was time to scout for deer, Eleanor eagerly agreed, hoping that perhaps the activity would restore some normalcy between them. They left the horses tied in the clearing and walked into the forest, Apache moving with purpose while Eleanor struggled to keep pace over the uneven terrain. Her boots, worn thin from 3 years of frontier life, provided little protection against the cold ground, and she could feel moisture seeping through to her stockings. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Eleanor's breath came out in visible puffs. "Apache, shouldn't we have brought our rifles?" she asked, noticing for the first time that he'd left both weapons with the horses. "We're just scouting, Eleanor. We'll come back for the guns once we spot the herd." His explanation made sense, but something about his tone, flat and emotionless, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her chest. They walked for another 20 minutes, climbing over fallen logs and pushing through underbrush that caught at Eleanor's skirts and scratched her hands. She was about to suggest they turn back when Apache suddenly stopped in front of her, his broad shoulders blocking her path. "Eleanor," he said quietly, still not turning around, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound, and she stepped closer, placing a tentative hand on his back. "What is it, darling?" "You can tell me anything." But when Apache finally turned to face her, the expression on his face made Eleanor's blood run cold. There was no warmth there, no affection, no remnant of the man who had courted her with wildflowers and promises of eternal devotion. Instead, she saw calculation, coldness, and something that looked terrifyingly like hatred. "I can't do this anymore," he said flatly. "I can't pretend to love you, can't pretend that this marriage is anything but a mistake I made when I was young and foolish." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet, and she reached out to steady herself against a tree, its rough bark biting into her palm. "What are you saying?" "Apache, I don't understand. We're married, we made vows before God and our community. We're supposed to—" But he cut her off with a harsh laugh that echoed through the silent forest. "Vows? Eleanor, you naive little fool. I married you because your father owned land I wanted access to, because you were pretty enough and seemed biddable enough. But you've become tedious, always questioning me, always wanting to talk about feelings and the future. I have plans, Eleanor. Plans that don't include a whining wife who can't give me the sons I need." The cruelty in his words was breathtaking, and Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, some fundamental belief in goodness and love shattering into irreparable pieces. "But I thought, you said you loved me. You said I was your everything." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot against her frozen cheeks, and she hated herself for crying, for showing weakness to this man who clearly despised her. Apache shrugged, unmoved by her distress. "I said what I needed to say to get what I wanted. That's how the world works, Eleanor. The strong take from the weak, and you've always been weak. Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. Whatever I've done wrong, I'll fix it. I'll be better. I'll be whatever you need me to be. Just don't." But she couldn't finish the sentence because some part of her already knew what was coming. Some deep instinct was screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there pleading with a man who had already made his decision. Apache took a step back and then another, putting distance between them. "There's someone else," he said matter-of-factly. "Margaret Thornton, from the settlement 10 miles west. Her husband died last spring, and she owns prime timberland worth a fortune. She's agreed to marry me, but obviously that's impossible while I'm still tied to you." Eleanor's mind reeled, trying to process the magnitude of his betrayal. "But divorce? We could get a divorce. It's difficult, but it can be done. Apache, you don't have to—" She saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke it aloud. "Divorce is expensive, complicated, and would ruin my reputation. This is simpler." He gestured around at the endless forest surrounding them. "We're miles from anywhere, Eleanor. No one knows where we are. I'll return to the cabin tonight, distraught and alone, and tell everyone you wandered off, despite my warnings. I'll search for days, of course, the grieving husband desperate to find his beloved wife. But these woods are dangerous, full of wolves and bears and cliffs hidden by undergrowth. Accidents happen all the time." The reality of what he was saying finally penetrated Eleanor's shock, and pure terror flooded her system. "You're going to leave me here? Apache, it's going to storm tonight. I'll freeze to death. There are wild animals. I don't have any supplies. I don't even know which direction leads to safety. You can't do this. You can't just murder me." Her voice rose to a scream, echoing uselessly through the indifferent trees. Apache's expression remained unchanged, cold and resolute. "I'm not murdering you, Eleanor. I'm simply leaving you to face the consequences of your own inadequacy. If you were stronger, more resourceful, you'd survive. But we both know you won't." He turned to leave, and Eleanor lunged forward, grabbing his arm with desperate strength. "No, please, God, no. Don't leave me here. I'll disappear. I'll tell everyone I'm leaving you. I'll go back east to my family, and you'll never see me again. Please, Apache, I'm begging you." She was on her knees now, clutching at his coat while sobs racked her body. For just a moment, Apache looked down at her, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it regret? Doubt, but then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. He shook her off roughly, and she fell backward onto the frozen ground, her hands landing in a patch of ice-crusted leaves. "Goodbye, Eleanor," Apache said quietly, and then he walked away, his footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Eleanor scrambled to her feet and ran after him, screaming his name, begging him to reconsider, promising anything and everything if he would just take her back. But Apache didn't slow down, didn't look back, and within minutes he had disappeared into the dense forest, leaving Eleanor alone in a silence so complete it felt like death itself. She stood there for a long moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind unable to accept what had just happened. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Any moment now, Apache would come back, would tell her this was some cruel test of her devotion, would laugh and hold her and promise never to scare her like that again. But he didn't come back. The minutes stretched into an hour, and the grey sky grew darker, and Eleanor finally understood with terrible clarity that her husband had truly abandoned her to die. The realization brought a fresh wave of panic so intense she thought she might vomit. She was alone in the wilderness, with no supplies, no weapons, no idea how to find her way home. She'd grown up in Boston, the daughter of a merchant, and her frontier skills were minimal at best. Apache had always handled the hunting, the tracking, the survival tasks. Eleanor could cook and sew and keep a house, but those skills were useless here. Miles from civilization, with a storm approaching and the temperature dropping by the minute, she forced herself to breathe, to think. Panicking would kill her faster than the cold. She needed to move, needed to try to find her way back to the clearing where they'd left the horses. If she could reach the horses, she could ride home, could expose Apache's treachery, could save herself. Eleanor looked around, trying to remember the direction they'd come from, but everything looked the same. Endless trees, brown and grey and forbidding. She picked what she hoped was the right direction and started walking, pushing through brush that tore at her dress and stumbling over roots hidden beneath the leaf litter. Her hands were already numb, and she tucked them under her arms, trying to preserve what warmth she had left. She walked for what felt like hours, but might have been only 30 minutes. Time losing meaning in her terror and confusion. Nothing looked familiar, and Eleanor realized with sinking despair that she was lost, truly and completely lost. She called out for help, her voice growing hoarse, but received no answer except the mocking echo of her own desperation. As the sky darkened further, the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet, melting against her face. The storm Apache had dismissed so casually was arriving, and Eleanor had no shelter, no fire, no protection against what she knew would be a brutal night. She thought about her sister back east, about her parents who had died 2 years ago, about the life she'd imagined having with Apache, full of children and laughter and growing old together. All of it was gone now, stolen by the man she'd trusted most in the world. When Eleanor could walk no further, her legs trembling with exhaustion and cold, she found a massive fallen tree and crawled beneath its partial shelter. The space was cramped and smelled of decay, but it blocked some of the wind that had picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. She curled into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around her knees, and let herself cry, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very core of her being. She cried for her shattered trust, for her stolen future, for the realization that the man she'd loved had never existed, that Apache had been wearing a mask for 3 years, and she'd been too blind to see it. She cried until she had no tears left, until her body was shaking so hard her teeth rattled, until the darkness was complete and the snow was falling steadily, covering the ground in a white shroud. The cold was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced, seeping through her clothes and into her bones, making her thoughts slow and fuzzy. She knew about freezing to death, had heard stories about travelers found frozen solid in the spring thaw, and wondered how long it would take, how much it would hurt. Part of her wanted to give up, to close her eyes and let the cold take her, to end this nightmare of betrayal and terror. But another part, some stubborn core of survival she didn't know she possessed, refused to surrender. Apache wanted her to die here, expected her to die here, and something in Eleanor rebelled against giving him that satisfaction. If she was going to die, it wouldn't be because she'd laid down and accepted it. She would fight, even if fighting was futile, even if every odd was stacked against her. As the night deepened and the cold intensified, Eleanor heard sounds in the darkness, branches breaking, something large moving through the forest. Her heart hammered with fresh fear as she recognized the howl of wolves, closer than she'd ever heard them before. They were pack hunters, she knew, and would have no trouble tracking a lone, weakened human. Eleanor pressed herself further under the log, making herself as small as possible, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. The howls came closer, and she could hear them now, multiple animals, their paws crunching through the snow. She held her breath, every muscle rigid with terror, waiting for the moment when they would find her hiding spot, and her death would be violent rather than slow. But then something changed. The wolves' howls shifted from hunting calls to sounds of alarm, almost fear. There was a different noise now, something Eleanor couldn't identify, deep, guttural, powerful. The wolves scattered, their retreating yelps fading into the distance, and Eleanor was left in confused silence. What could frighten a wolf pack so thoroughly? What predator was large enough, dangerous enough, to send them fleeing? She peered out from her shelter, her frozen face barely able to move, and saw a massive shape silhouetted against the snow-covered ground. It was tall, impossibly tall, walking upright like a man but far too large to be human. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the creature moved closer, and in the pale light reflected off the snow, she saw it clearly for the first time. It was covered in dark fur, its body muscular and powerful, its face a strange blend of human and ape-like features. The creature the native tribes whispered about, the one settlers dismissed as superstitious nonsense, it was real, and it was standing less than 20 feet from where Eleanor hid. She waited for terror to overwhelm her, waited for the creature to attack, but instead it did something unexpected. It tilted its massive head, studying the area where she was hidden, and then it made a sound, low and questioning, almost gentle. Eleanor didn't move, didn't breathe, as the creature approached her fallen log. It crouched down, and she found herself staring into eyes that were startlingly intelligent, filled with something that looked almost like curiosity or concern. The creature, Bigfoot. Her mind, supplied helplessly, reached out one enormous hand, palm up, in a gesture that was unmistakably an offer of help. Eleanor's mind couldn't process what was happening, couldn't reconcile the monster from legends with the gentle patience in those eyes. She was freezing to death, abandoned by the human who should have protected her, and now faced with a creature that shouldn't exist, but somehow seemed to be offering salvation. The absurdity of it made her laugh, a sound that came out as more of a strangled sob. She had nothing left to lose, no other options, no hope of surviving the night without help. Slowly, her hands shaking violently from cold and fear, Eleanor reached out and placed her frozen fingers in that massive, fur-covered palm, and felt the creature's hand close gently around hers, warm and surprisingly careful. The creature lifted Eleanor as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against its massive chest with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so powerful. She should have been terrified, should have fought and screamed, but the warmth radiating from its fur-covered body was intoxicating after hours of brutal cold. And Eleanor found herself pressing closer, her frozen limbs desperate for any source of heat. The creature made a low rumbling sound, almost like a purr, and began walking through the forest with surprising grace, its long strides covering ground quickly while somehow managing not to jostle her too roughly. Eleanor's mind was foggy, hypothermia making her thoughts slow and disconnected, but she registered that they were moving upward, climbing toward higher ground, away from the valley floor where the worst of the storm was concentrating its fury. Through the swirling snow, Eleanor caught glimpses of their surroundings, rock formations jutting from the hillside, ancient trees that had probably stood for centuries, and finally, a dark opening in the cliff face that the creature was heading toward with clear purpose. A cave, Eleanor's dulled mind recognized, and caves meant shelter, meant protection from the wind and snow that was turning deadly. The creature ducked to enter the opening, and Eleanor felt the immediate difference as they moved out of the wind. The cave wasn't warm, not exactly, but it was dry and blocked the elements, and that alone felt like a miracle. The creature carried her deeper into the darkness, navigating by senses Eleanor couldn't fathom, and finally set her down gently on what felt like a bed of dried leaves and moss. Eleanor's body was shaking so violently she couldn't control it, her teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue and tasted blood. The creature made a concerned sound and disappeared into the darkness. She heard movement, the scrape of something heavy being dragged, and then there was a dull thud as the creature deposited an armful of firewood near where Eleanor lay. But wood alone wouldn't help. She needed fire, needed flame, and she had no way to create it. She tried to speak, to explain this problem, but her frozen jaw wouldn't cooperate and only a pitiful whimper emerged. The creature seemed to understand her distress, because it moved with sudden purpose, and Eleanor heard the unmistakable sound of flint striking stone. Sparks flew in the darkness, once, twice, 3 times, and then a small flame caught on some dried moss the creature had prepared. Eleanor watched in amazement as the creature carefully fed the tiny flame, adding small twigs and then larger pieces of wood with a skill that spoke of intelligence and experience. Within minutes, a proper fire was crackling, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls and sending blessed warmth into the cold space. The creature gestured toward the fire, clearly indicating that Eleanor should move closer, and she dragged herself forward on trembling limbs, holding her frozen hands toward the flames. The return of sensation was agony, pins and needles stabbing through her fingers and toes. But Eleanor welcomed the pain because it meant she was alive, meant her body hadn't given up yet. As warmth slowly seeped back into her body and her mind cleared, Eleanor studied her unlikely rescuer. The creature sat across the fire from her, its massive form hunched to fit in the cave, watching her with those disconcertingly intelligent eyes. It was male, she was fairly certain, standing at least 8 feet tall with shoulders broader than any man she'd ever seen. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in places, and covered its entire body except for the palms of its hands and the soles of its feet, which were leathery and calloused. The face was the most unsettling feature, not quite human, not quite ape, but something in between that suggested a different evolutionary path, a cousin to humanity that had chosen the wilderness over civilization. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "You saved my life." She didn't know if the creature could understand her words, but she felt compelled to express her gratitude. The creature tilted its head, and Eleanor could have sworn she saw understanding in those dark eyes. It reached behind itself and produced something that made Eleanor's heart skip, her leather satchel, the one Apache had been carrying with their supplies. The creature must have gone back to the clearing, must have retrieved the bag from the abandoned campsite. It pushed the satchel toward her across the cave floor, and Eleanor opened it with shaking hands to find the dried meat, the tin cup, the flint and steel that Apache had packed for his supposed hunting trip. The discovery of the supplies brought a fresh wave of emotion. But this time it wasn't despair, it was anger. Apache had planned this, had packed supplies he knew he'd need for his journey back, while bringing Eleanor along with nothing but the clothes on her back. Every detail had been calculated, every step of her murder carefully orchestrated. The realization hardened something in Eleanor's chest, transforming her grief into a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. She'd been raised to be gentle, to be forgiving, to accept her lot in life with grace and submission. But those teachings felt hollow now, irrelevant in the face of what had been done to her. Apache wanted her dead, expected her to die, and Eleanor suddenly wanted nothing more than to prove him wrong, to survive out of pure spite if nothing else. She pulled out a piece of dried meat and bit into it. The tough, salty food, the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. The creature watched her eat, with what seemed like satisfaction, and Eleanor realized it must be hungry too. She held out a piece of the meat, offering it to the creature in the same way it had offered its hand to her earlier. The creature leaned forward and took the meat with surprising delicacy, its massive fingers somehow managing not to touch hers as it accepted the gift. It ate slowly, chewing thoughtfully, and Eleanor found herself fascinated by the human-like mannerisms mixed with distinctly non-human features. When it finished, the creature made a low sound and stood, moving to the back of the cave where Eleanor could hear water dripping. It returned with its cupped hands full of water, offering it to her, and Eleanor drank gratefully, the cold liquid soothing her raw throat. As the night wore on and the storm raged outside the cave entrance, Eleanor and the creature settled into a strange companionship. The creature fed the fire regularly, keeping it at a level that provided warmth without smoking them out. It brought more water when Eleanor's cup was empty, and at one point it disappeared into a side tunnel and returned with what looked like edible roots, offering them to her with an almost shy hesitation. Eleanor accepted them and found they tasted sweet and slightly nutty, better than many vegetables she'd prepared in her own kitchen. She wanted to ask the creature so many questions. How long had it lived in these mountains? Was it alone? Did it understand what had happened to her? Could it possibly comprehend the betrayal she'd suffered? But she had no way to communicate beyond gestures and expressions. Instead, Eleanor found herself talking anyway, her words spilling out in a stream of consciousness that she couldn't hold back. She told the creature about Apache, about the 3 years of marriage that had been built on lies, about her dreams of having children and growing old with someone who loved her. She talked about her childhood in Boston, her parents' death, her sister who had begged her not to move west with a man she barely knew. She confessed her doubts and fears, admitted that she'd suspected for months that something was wrong, but had been too afraid to confront the truth. The creature listened, never interrupting, its eyes fixed on her face with an attention that felt more genuine than anything Apache had given her in the past year. And somehow, speaking these truths to a creature that couldn't judge her or tell her she was foolish, felt more healing than any conversation she'd had with another human. When exhaustion finally claimed her, Eleanor's eyes growing heavy despite her attempts to stay awake, the creature did something that brought tears to her frozen cheeks. It moved around the fire and settled beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel its warmth, close enough that she felt protected rather than alone. As Eleanor drifted into sleep, her last conscious thought was that this creature, this supposed monster, had shown her more kindness in a few hours than her husband had shown in 3 years. And the irony of that truth was almost unbearable. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, her body finally able to rest, knowing that something was watching over her, keeping the fire alive, keeping the darkness at bay. Eleanor woke to pale morning light filtering into the cave and the smell of smoke from the banked fire. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then everything came rushing back. Apache's betrayal, the storm, the creature that had saved her life. She sat up quickly, her muscles screaming in protest, and looked around the cave. The creature was gone, but the fire had been freshly stoked, and there was food laid out beside her, more roots, some kind of dried berries, and what looked like strips of cooked meat. The creature had hunted for her, had prepared food, and left it for her to find upon waking. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes again, overwhelmed by this continued kindness from something the world would call a monster. She ate slowly, trying to form a plan. The storm had passed, and weak winter sunlight was visible through the cave entrance. She needed to find her way back to civilization, needed to expose Apache for what he'd done, needed to reclaim some semblance of her life. But the thought of leaving this cave, of facing the wilderness alone again, filled her with dread. She had no idea which direction to go, no skills to help her survive if she encountered trouble. And there was another problem: who would believe her story? A woman returning from the dead, claiming her husband had tried to murder her, would face enormous skepticism, especially when that husband was as charming and well-liked as Apache. And if she mentioned being saved by a creature from legend, they'd declare her mad and possibly lock her away for her own protection. Eleanor was still wrestling with these thoughts when the creature returned, ducking into the cave with something large draped over its shoulder. It was a deer freshly killed, and the creature set about butchering it with practiced efficiency, using a sharp stone to cut the meat into manageable portions. It worked quickly, and Eleanor realized it was preparing the meat for smoking or drying, ensuring food supplies would last. The creature seemed to sense her watching because it looked up and made a questioning sound, gesturing between Eleanor and the cave entrance. It was asking if she wanted to leave, Eleanor understood, offering her the choice rather than keeping her captive. "I don't know where to go," Eleanor admitted, knowing the creature couldn't understand her words, but needing to say them anyway. "I can't go home, not yet. Apache thinks I'm dead, and maybe that's the only advantage I have." If I show up alive, what's to stop him from trying again, from finishing what he started? The creature watched her intently, and Eleanor continued, the words coming faster now. But I can't survive out here alone. I'll die within days, and then Apache wins anyway. I'm trapped, don't you see? Trapped between a husband who wants me dead and a wilderness that will kill me just as surely. The creature made a decision then, one that Eleanor saw clearly in its eyes and posture. It pointed to itself, then to Eleanor, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the cave and the forest beyond. It was offering her sanctuary, offering to teach her, to help her survive. Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that this creature knew these mountains intimately, knew every source of food and water, knew how to read the weather and avoid predators. It was offering to share that knowledge, to give her the tools she'd need, not just to survive, but to become strong enough to face Apache on her own terms. The generosity of the offer, especially from a being that had no obligation to help her, made Eleanor's chest tight with emotion. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I want to learn. I want to become someone who can't be abandoned to die, someone who doesn't need a man to survive. Will you teach me? The creature seemed to understand her acceptance because it made a satisfied sound and returned to butchering the deer. Eleanor stood on shaky legs and moved closer, watching carefully as the creature worked. It noticed her attention and slowed its movements, showing her how to identify the best cuts of meat, how to separate hide from flesh, how to use every part of the animal without waste. Eleanor's stomach turned at first, her city upbringing making her squeamish, but she forced herself to watch, to learn, understanding that squeamishness was a luxury she could no longer afford. Over the following days, an unlikely partnership formed between the abandoned woman and the legendary creature. The creature, Eleanor started calling it friend in her mind, needing some way to think of it, proved to be a patient and thorough teacher. It showed her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, making her smell and touch them until she could identify them by sight alone. It taught her to read animal tracks in the snow, to distinguish between deer and elk, between fox and wolf. It demonstrated how to find water by following game trails and reading the landscape, how to predict weather by watching the sky and smelling the air. Eleanor absorbed everything desperately, understanding that each lesson was potentially the difference between life and death. Friend also taught her practical skills that Eleanor had never imagined needing. It showed her how to make snares from thin branches and plant fibers, how to set them along animal paths where they'd be most effective. It taught her to fish using sharpened sticks and patience, standing motionless in icy streams until the moment was right to strike. It demonstrated how to start a fire without flint and steel, using a bow drill that required practice and persistence to master. Eleanor's hands blistered and bled as she learned these skills, but she welcomed the pain as evidence of her transformation from helpless victim to capable survivor. Every blister was a small victory over Apache's expectations, over his certainty that she'd die within hours of being abandoned. The physical work changed Eleanor's body as well as her skills. She'd always been slender, even delicate, but weeks of climbing mountains and carrying water and processing game built muscle and endurance she'd never possessed. Her soft hands became calloused, her pale skin weathered by wind and cold. She learned to move quietly through the forest, to step where friends stepped, to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder within it. And as her body grew stronger, so did her spirit. The woman who had begged Apache not to leave her felt like a stranger, someone weak and pitiable that Eleanor no longer recognized. In her place was emerging someone harder, someone who could face the truth of the world's cruelty without collapsing. But it wasn't all harsh lessons and survival skills. Friend also showed Eleanor moments of unexpected beauty that reminded her why life was worth fighting for. It led her to a frozen waterfall that caught the morning light and transformed into a cascade of diamonds. It brought her to a clearing where elk gathered at sunset, their bugling calls echoing across the valley in a sound so primal and beautiful it brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. It showed her how to move through the forest at night, when the darkness that had terrified her became alive with sounds and shadows that were no longer threatening but simply part of the natural rhythm of life. These moments of beauty were gifts, Friend's way of showing her that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about finding reasons to want to live. As winter deepened and the snows grew heavier, Eleanor and Friend settled into a routine that felt almost domestic. They'd wake with the dawn, and Friend would go hunting while Eleanor maintained the fire and prepared whatever food they had stored. When Friend returned, often with game or fish, they'd work together to process it, Eleanor's skills improving until she could dress a rabbit or gut a fish without hesitation. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, and Eleanor would talk, telling Friend stories from her past, from books she'd read, from dreams she'd once held. Friend never interrupted, never judged, just listened with those impossibly intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than should be possible. One morning in late December, Eleanor woke to find Friend already up, standing at the cave entrance and staring out at something that had captured its complete attention. She rose and joined it, following its gaze down the mountainside to where smoke rose from a distant valley, the settlement. Eleanor realized with a jolt the place where Apache would have returned months ago with his story of her tragic disappearance. She'd been so focused on survival, on learning and growing stronger, that she'd almost forgotten the world beyond these mountains still existed. But seeing that smoke brought everything rushing back, the betrayal, the injustice, the fact that Apache was down there living freely while everyone believed Eleanor was dead. "He's probably married to her by now," Eleanor said quietly, her breath misting in the cold air. "Margaret Thornton, the woman with the valuable timberland. Apache's probably playing the grieving widower while courting her. Probably has everyone's sympathy while planning his next move up in the world." The thought filled Eleanor with renewed anger. But it was a different kind of anger than before, colder, more focused, more patient. She wasn't ready to face Apache yet, wasn't ready to return to a world that might not believe her or might blame her for surviving. But someday she would be ready, and when that day came, Apache would learn that abandoning her had been the worst mistake of his life. Friend made a questioning sound, and Eleanor looked up at the massive creature that had become her companion, her teacher, her unlikely friend. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me," she said softly. "You saved my life, and then you gave me the tools to save myself. I don't know why you helped me, why you didn't just leave me to die like Apache did. But I'll never forget it." Friend reached out and gently touched Eleanor's shoulder. The gesture so human and so filled with what seemed like affection that Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears. She'd been starving for kindness, she realized. Starving for someone to care whether she lived or died. And this creature had provided that when her own husband had refused. The winter months passed in a blur of lessons and survival, of small triumphs and occasional setbacks. Eleanor learned to track deer through deep snow, following their trails, until she could predict where they'd go for shelter. She mastered the art of ice fishing, learning to read the frozen surfaces of lakes to find where fish congregated. She practiced constantly with her snares, adjusting placement and technique until she could reliably catch rabbits and other small game. Friend watched her progress with what Eleanor could only interpret as pride. And when she succeeded at a particularly difficult task, it would make a huffing sound that seemed remarkably like laughter. But Eleanor also learned harsh lessons about the brutality of nature. She watched Friend kill a wolf that had ventured too close to their cave, the fight swift and vicious, reminding her that survival often meant violence. She found the frozen corpse of a deer that had starved when the snow grew too deep for it to reach food, its death slow and agonizing. She learned that the forest didn't care about fairness or justice, that it simply was, indifferent to suffering and beauty in equal measure. These lessons hardened her further, stripping away the last remnants of the naive woman who had believed that goodness would be rewarded and love would last forever. As winter began its slow transition toward spring, Eleanor started planning her eventual return to civilization. She couldn't stay in the mountains forever, no matter how much part of her wanted to remain here, where life was difficult but honest, where the dangers were obvious rather than hidden behind smiles and false promises. She had a choice to make. She could start a new life somewhere far from Apache, could travel east and reunite with her sister, could become someone entirely different with a fabricated past and a future built on lies. Or she could go back to the settlement, could confront Apache and expose him for what he was, could fight for some measure of justice even if it meant risking everything. Friend seemed to sense the approaching change, the restlessness in Eleanor that came from unfinished business. It started taking her on longer expeditions, showing her landmarks and trails that led toward the settlement, ensuring she'd be able to find her way when the time came. It taught her to hunt larger game, to bring down a deer with a spear. Friend helped her craft, teaching her that she could be predator as well as prey. These lessons felt like preparations, like Friend was equipping her for the challenges that awaited beyond the safety of their mountain sanctuary. And with each lesson, Eleanor felt herself becoming someone new, someone forged in betrayal and tempered by survival. One evening in early March, as they sat by the fire and listened to the drip of melting snow outside the cave, Eleanor made her decision. "I have to go back," she told Friend, the words coming with surprising ease. "I have to face him, have to make sure he doesn't do this to another woman. Margaret Thornton deserves to know what kind of man she's considering marrying. And I need to look Apache in the eyes and show him that I survived, that his cruelty didn't break me the way he intended." Friend watched her silently, and Eleanor continued, needing to explain. "I'm not the woman he abandoned. That woman died in this forest, just like Apache planned. But someone else was born here, someone stronger, and he needs to see her. He needs to know he failed." Friend made a low sound, almost sad, and Eleanor realized the creature understood that her leaving was inevitable. They'd been companions for months, living in closer quarters than Eleanor had lived with most humans, and a bond had formed that transcended species or language. Friend had been kinder to her than any person in her life, had shown her more care and patience than her own husband had ever managed. The thought of leaving, of never seeing Friend again, sent a sharp pain through Eleanor's chest. But she also knew she couldn't hide forever, couldn't let Apache's crime go unpunished, simply because facing him was frightening. "Will you be all right here alone?" Eleanor asked, knowing the question was ridiculous. Friend had survived for who knew how many years before finding her, would certainly survive after she left. But she needed to ask, needed to express her concern for this being that had become so important to her. Friend huffed and gestured around the cave, then to itself, the meaning clear. It would be fine, had always been fine, would continue to be fine. But then it did something unexpected. It reached behind itself and pulled out a small pouch Eleanor had never seen before, made from tanned hide and decorated with simple patterns. Friend held it out to her, and when Eleanor opened it, she found it contained dried herbs and roots that Friend had taught her about, remedies for pain, for illness, for wounds. "A gift," Eleanor whispered, touched beyond words. "Thank you, Friend. I'll treasure this always." She wished desperately that she had something to give in return, but she owned nothing except the clothes on her back and the knowledge Friend had shared with her. Then inspiration struck. Eleanor untied the ribbon from her hair, one of the few possessions she'd had when Apache abandoned her, made of silk and dyed a deep blue that had been her mother's favorite color. It was one of her last connections to her old life, but she wanted Friend to have it, wanted to leave something behind that said she'd been here, that their time together had mattered. She held out the ribbon, and Friend took it with surprising gentleness, examining it with obvious fascination before carefully tying it around its massive wrist, where it looked absurdly delicate against the dark fur. Eleanor spent the next 2 weeks preparing for her journey, gathering supplies and mentally rehearsing what she'd say when she returned to the settlement. Friend helped her prepare smoked meat and dried berries, enough to last for the trek down the mountain and the difficult days that would follow. It gave her a knife it had somehow acquired. Eleanor didn't ask how or from where, its blade sharp and its handle worn smooth from use. It showed her the safest route down the mountain, pointing out landmarks and warning her about areas where the terrain was particularly treacherous. Every lesson felt like a goodbye, and Eleanor's heart grew heavier with each passing day. The morning she left dawned clear and cold. The sky, that brilliant blue that only comes after winter storms, have scrubbed it clean. Eleanor packed her supplies carefully, checking and rechecking that she had everything she needed. Friend watched from the cave entrance, its posture radiating a sadness that Eleanor felt echoed in her own chest. When everything was ready, when there were no more excuses to delay, Eleanor turned to face the creature that had saved her life and changed her forever. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You gave me back my life, gave me back myself. I'll never forget you, friend, never." Friend stepped forward and very gently placed one massive hand on top of Eleanor's head, the gesture somehow conveying blessing and farewell and affection all at once. Then it stepped back and gestured toward the trail, giving her permission to go, releasing her from any obligation. Eleanor shouldered her pack and walked out of the cave, forcing herself not to look back, because she knew if she did, she might not have the strength to leave. She made it perhaps 50 yards down the trail before she couldn't help herself, before she had to turn around one last time. Friend was still standing at the cave entrance, watching her go, one hand raised in what could only be described as a wave. Eleanor waved back, tears streaming down her face, and then turned and continued down the mountain, carrying with her the lessons and love of the most unexpected friendship of her life. The journey to the settlement took 3 days of hard travel through terrain that was just beginning to thaw. Eleanor moved carefully, using everything Friend had taught her about reading the land and avoiding danger. She saw deer and elk, even a bear emerging groggily from hibernation, but she moved quietly and gave them wide berth, having no desire for confrontation. At night, she made efficient camps, building small fires and sleeping lightly, always aware that she was no longer under Friend's protection. But she felt confident in her abilities now, felt certain she could handle whatever challenges arose, and that confidence was perhaps Friend's greatest gift. As Eleanor approached the settlement on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she stopped at a stream to wash and attempt to make herself presentable. Her reflection in the water showed a stranger, a woman with skin weathered by sun and wind, with muscles visible in her arms and shoulders, with eyes that had seen too much and learned to be hard. Her hair, which Apache had loved for its auburn shine, was tangled and streaked with premature gray. Her dress, once her second-best Sunday outfit, was patched and stained beyond repair. She looked like someone who had survived something terrible, which was exactly what she was. Eleanor braided her hair as best she could and tried to brush the worst of the trail dust from her clothes. But there was only so much she could do. She would arrive looking like a ghost, and perhaps that was appropriate. The settlement came into view as the sun was setting, its handful of buildings casting long shadows across the muddy main street. Eleanor paused at the edge of town, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the moment when she'd step back into the world and face the man who'd tried to murder her. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked into town, heading directly for the trading post where she knew people would be gathering at this hour. Every step felt surreal, like she was moving through a dream, and Eleanor half expected to wake up back in the cave with Friend watching over her. The bell above the trading post door chimed as Eleanor pushed it open, and the conversation inside stopped abruptly. Every head turned toward her, and Eleanor watched as recognition dawned on face after face, followed immediately by shock and disbelief. Eleanor. Old Thomas behind the counter dropped the bottle he'd been holding, and it shattered on the floor, whiskey spreading in a dark stain. "Eleanor Blackwood? But you're dead," Apache said. "We searched for weeks. How is this possible?" "I'm not dead," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying in the stunned silence. "My husband left me to die in the forest, but I survived." She scanned the faces in the room, looking for Apache, but he wasn't there. "Where is he? Where is Apache Blackwood?" The silence stretched uncomfortably until Thomas finally spoke, his face pale with shock. "He's at the Thornton property, miss. Been courting Margaret Thornton these past months. They're set to be married next week, actually. Whole town's been invited to the celebration." The confirmation of what Eleanor had expected still hit her like a physical blow, but she refused to show weakness. "Then I need to see Margaret Thornton immediately. She deserves to know what kind of man she's planning to marry." Eleanor turned to leave, but Thomas called out to her. "Wait, Eleanor, you need to know. Apache's been telling everyone you wandered off, despite his warnings, that you weren't in your right mind. He's been playing the grieving husband, has the whole town's sympathy. If you start making accusations against him, people might not believe you. He's become quite respected here, especially with Margaret's endorsement. Let them doubt me," Eleanor said firmly. "I know the truth, and that's enough. Margaret Thornton deserves the truth too, even if no one else cares to hear it." She walked out of the trading post, aware of the whispers exploding behind her, knowing that word of her return would spread through the small settlement like wildfire. Apache would know she was alive within the hour, would be scrambling to figure out how to explain her return while maintaining his lies. Good. Let him panic. Let him feel a fraction of the fear she'd felt when he abandoned her to die. The Thornton property was a well-maintained farm about a mile outside the main settlement, and Eleanor covered the distance quickly, fueled by righteous anger. The sun had set fully by the time she arrived, but lamps were burning in the windows of the main house, making it easy to find. Eleanor walked up to the front door and knocked firmly, her heart pounding but her resolve absolute. She heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened to reveal a handsome woman in her mid-30s, with dark hair and kind eyes that widened in surprise at seeing a stranger on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" Margaret Thornton asked politely, though her expression was confused. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood," she said clearly. "I'm Apache Blackwood's wife, and I need to speak with you immediately about the man you're planning to marry." Margaret's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally something that might have been fear. But Apache said, "He told me his wife died last autumn, that she was lost in the forest and never found. He mourned you, wept for you. How can you be standing here?" "May I come in?" Eleanor asked. "This isn't a conversation for a doorstep, and what I have to tell you will take some time." Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between disbelief and curiosity, but finally stepped aside and gestured for Eleanor to enter. The interior of the house was warm and comfortable, furnished with the kind of quality pieces that spoke of real wealth. Margaret led Eleanor to a sitting room and indicated a chair, then sat across from her, her face a mixture of confusion and growing concern. "Please," Margaret said quietly, "tell me everything." Eleanor told her story from the beginning, starting with her marriage to Apache 3 years earlier and the slow deterioration of their relationship. She described the hunting trip, Apache's confession, his cold calculation as he abandoned her to die. She explained how she'd survived that first terrible night, though she was careful about how she described friend, saying only that she'd found shelter and learned to survive through trial and error. She didn't think Margaret was ready to hear about a legendary creature living in the mountains, and honestly, Eleanor wanted to protect friend from human curiosity and potential exploitation. That part of her story was hers alone, too precious to share. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face growing paler as Eleanor's tale unfolded. When Eleanor finished, Margaret sat in stunned silence for a long moment before speaking. "I don't want to believe you," she said quietly. Apache has been nothing but kind to me these past months. He's been patient about my grief over my husband, respectful about taking things slowly. He's told me stories about you, about how much he loved you, about how devastated he was by your loss. But, Eleanor prompted, sensing that Margaret had her own doubts. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. There have been small things that bothered me, she admitted. The way he talks about his future, about plans that seem very detailed for a man still grieving. Questions he's asked about my property, about the value of the timber, about my financial arrangements. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd been alone too long and was seeing shadows where none existed. But if what you're saying is true, it's true, Eleanor said firmly. Every word. And Margaret, he'll do the same thing to you eventually. Maybe not immediately. Maybe he'll wait until after marriage when he has legal rights to your property. But Apache doesn't love anyone but himself. You're just another means to an end, another step up the ladder he's climbing. I'm not here to ruin your life or cause drama. I'm here to save you from making the same mistake I did, from trusting a man who sees people as tools, to be used and discarded. Margaret turned back to face Eleanor, and tears were streaming down her face. I wanted so badly to believe in love again, she whispered. After my husband died, I felt so alone, and Apache seemed like a gift from God, a second chance at happiness. But you're telling me it was all a lie, that he was counting on my loneliness to make me vulnerable. Eleanor stood and crossed to Margaret, taking the other woman's hands in hers. I'm so sorry, Eleanor said gently. I know how much it hurts to realize the person you trusted was betraying you all along. But you have something I didn't. You have warning. You can protect yourself, can send him away before he has a chance to hurt you the way he hurt me. What will you do? Margaret asked, wiping at her tears. Will you have him arrested? Eleanor shook her head slowly. I have no proof beyond my word against his, and as you said, Apache has made himself respected here. He'll claim I'm lying, that I'm mentally unstable, that I ran away and now I'm trying to ruin him out of spite. The law won't help me, not without evidence, not when it's a wife accusing a husband of attempted murder. But I can make sure everyone knows the truth. I can make sure his reputation is destroyed the way he tried to destroy my life. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Both women tensed and Margaret moved to the window. It's Apache, she said quietly. He's riding hard and he looks... She trailed off, but Eleanor knew what she'd been about to say. He looked angry, dangerous, like a man whose carefully constructed lies were falling apart. Eleanor felt a spike of fear, but pushed it down, drawing on the strength she'd built over months of survival. She'd faced wolves and storms and the prospect of freezing to death. She could face Apache Blackwood. The front door burst open without a knock, and Apache strode into the house, his face flushed with rage and something that looked like fear. He stopped short when he saw Eleanor standing in Margaret's sitting room, and for just a moment, Eleanor saw pure shock cross his features before he mastered himself. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was shaking. Thank God you're alive. I've been searching for you, been sick with worry. Where have you been? What happened to you? And that you're happy to see me. We both know you left me in that forest to die, Apache. We both know you planned every detail of my murder. Apache's face transformed, the mask of concern dropping away to reveal cold calculation. You're clearly unwell, Eleanor. The trauma of being lost has affected your mind. Margaret, I apologize that you have to witness this, but my poor wife has obviously suffered some kind of mental break. I'll take her home and get her the care she needs. She's not going anywhere with you, Margaret said firmly, moving to stand beside Eleanor. And I want you to leave my property immediately. Apache's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting Margaret to take Eleanor's side. Margaret, please. You can't believe her wild accusations. I loved Eleanor, I grieved for her. Whatever she thinks happened, it's a delusion brought on by exposure and fear. Let me help her. I know exactly what happened, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. You told me about Margaret, about your plans to marry her for her timberland. You said divorce was too expensive and complicated, that it was simpler to leave me to freeze to death. You told me I was weak, that I wouldn't survive. But you were wrong, Apache. I did survive, and now everyone is going to know what you are." Apache's expression turned ugly, all pretense abandoned. "No one will believe you. A hysterical woman, making accusations against her devoted husband. They'll think you've lost your mind, and Margaret, they'll think you're a fool for listening to her. I have this entire town's respect and sympathy. What do you have? Nothing but wild stories and paranoid delusions." He took a step toward Eleanor, his hands clenched into fists. "You should have died in that forest like you were supposed to. You should have stayed gone." "Get out of my house," Margaret said, her voice like steel. "Get out now, or I'll shoot you for trespassing." She pulled a small pistol from a drawer in the side table, her hands remarkably steady. "I mean it, Apache. Leave immediately." Apache looked between the two women, seeming to realize he'd lost this battle. His face twisted with rage and frustration. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You can't prove anything, Eleanor. It's your word against mine, and my word carries weight in this town. I'll destroy you for this." "You already tried to destroy me," Eleanor replied calmly. "And I'm still here. That should tell you something about how easy I am to destroy." Apache turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Eleanor's legs suddenly felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling with delayed reaction. Margaret lowered the pistol and sat down as well, both women breathing hard. "That was terrifying," Margaret admitted, "but also strangely satisfying. Thank you for warning me, Eleanor. If you hadn't come tonight, I would have married him next week. What happens now?" Eleanor asked, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation had drained her more than a day of climbing mountains, and she realized she had nowhere to go, no home to return to. Margaret seemed to read her thoughts because she reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "You'll stay here tonight and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Apache was right about one thing. Without proof, getting legal justice will be difficult. But we can make sure everyone knows the truth about him. Can make sure he never hurts another woman the way he hurt you. Over the following days, word of Eleanor's return and her accusations against Apache spread through the settlement like wildfire. The community was divided. Some believed Eleanor's story, particularly the women who recognized the signs of a charming man hiding cruelty beneath the surface. Others sided with Apache, claiming Eleanor was clearly disturbed and making false accusations to cover her own actions in running away. Apache himself launched a campaign to discredit Eleanor, telling anyone who would listen that his wife had always been unstable, prone to dramatic outbursts and irrational behavior. He painted himself as the long-suffering husband trying to help his mentally ill wife, while she repaid his devotion with slander. The settlement's minister, Reverend Hallowell, called a community meeting to address the situation, hoping to find some resolution that would restore peace. The meeting was held in the church, and nearly everyone in the settlement attended, curious to hear both sides of the story. Eleanor sat in the front row with Margaret beside her, feeling every eye in the room boring into her back. Apache sat on the opposite side, surrounded by his supporters, looking confident and righteous. When Reverend Hallowell called the meeting to order, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. "We're gathered here today to address serious accusations made by Eleanor Blackwood against her husband Apache," Reverend Hallowell began. "These are grave matters that strike at the heart of our community's values. Eleanor, would you like to speak first?" Eleanor stood, her legs steady despite her nervousness. She'd faced worse than judgmental stares and whispered doubts. She'd faced death itself and won. "I know many of you don't want to believe what I'm about to say," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "I know Apache has made himself well-liked here, has presented himself as an upstanding member of this community. But I'm here to tell you the truth about what happened last November." She told her story again, in more detail this time, describing the hunting trip, Apache's confession, his cold calculation as he abandoned her. She described the terror of that first night, the certainty that she would die. She carefully edited the parts about Friend, saying only that she found shelter and learned to survive through determination and luck. When she finished, the room erupted in whispers and arguments. Apache stood immediately, his face the picture of concerned compassion. "My poor Eleanor," he said sadly. "I think we can all see that she's suffered terribly. Being lost in the wilderness for months has clearly affected her mental state. She needs help, not encouragement in these delusions. I never abandoned her. She wandered away from our camp despite my warnings, and I searched for weeks trying to find her." "That's a lie," Eleanor said firmly. "You know it's a lie, Apache. You know exactly what you did." Apache shook his head sorrowfully. "Eleanor, I've tried to be patient with you, tried to understand. But these accusations are destroying my reputation and hurting this community. If you don't stop spreading these..." "Gather herbs," not wanting to alert Apache to their true purpose. The journey was difficult for Margaret, who wasn't accustomed to the rugged terrain, but Eleanor found herself moving through the forest with ease, all of Friend's lessons coming back naturally. She tracked their route carefully, looking for landmarks she remembered from that terrible day when Apache had led her to her intended death. It took 2 days of searching, but Eleanor finally recognized the twisted trees that had marked the clearing where Apache had told her the truth. Her heart pounded as they pushed through the underbrush, and then there it was, the clearing, looking almost exactly as it had that November day. And there, partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and new spring growth, were the supplies Apache had abandoned. Eleanor and Margaret dug through the cache, finding the food Apache had packed for himself, the extra blankets and rope, the weapons he'd need for his solo journey back. "This is it," Eleanor whispered. "This is proof that Apache planned to return alone, that he never intended for me to survive." They carefully documented everything, making detailed notes about what they found and where. Margaret suggested they bring the supplies back as evidence, and Eleanor agreed, feeling a surge of hope that maybe, finally, she'd have the proof needed to expose Apache's crime. But as they were repacking the supplies, Eleanor heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices, and one of them was Apache's. He'd followed them somehow, had figured out what they were doing. Eleanor grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her behind a large boulder, gesturing for silence. Apache emerged into the clearing with 2 men Eleanor recognized as his staunchest supporters. "I told you she'd come back here," Apache was saying. "She's trying to manufacture evidence against me, probably planning to plant false proof of her ridiculous story." He began searching the clearing, moving closer to where Eleanor and Margaret hid. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape without being caught. If Apache found them here, he could claim they were tampering with evidence, could use it as proof of Eleanor's supposed mental instability. But then, something extraordinary happened. There was a deep rumbling sound from the forest edge, and all 3 men froze. Eleanor's heart leaped because she recognized that sound. It was Friend. The creature emerged from the trees, its massive form seeming even larger in the afternoon light, and the effect on Apache and his companions was instantaneous. They stumbled backward, terror written across their faces, one of them screaming in pure panic. Friend moved forward deliberately, not attacking, but clearly positioning itself between the men and where Eleanor hid, protecting her even though Friend couldn't possibly have known she was there. Apache's face had gone white as snow. "What? What is that thing?" he gasped, and Eleanor heard genuine fear in his voice, the kind of primal terror that strips away all pretense. Friend made another sound, louder this time, and took another step forward. That was enough for Apache's companions, who turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush in their panic. Apache followed a moment later, looking back over his shoulder at Friend with an expression of absolute horror. Only when they were gone, when the sound of their retreat had faded completely, did Friend turn and look directly at the boulder where Eleanor hid. Eleanor emerged slowly, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe that Friend had found her, had come to help when she needed it most. "Friend," she whispered, and the creature made a soft sound of recognition. Margaret emerged behind Eleanor, staring at Friend with a mixture of awe and fear. That's really... She couldn't finish the sentence, too overwhelmed by the impossibility of what she was seeing. Friend studied Margaret for a moment, then seemed to accept her presence, turning its attention back to Eleanor. "Thank you," Eleanor said, moving closer to the creature that had saved her life twice now. "Thank you for protecting me again." Friend reached out and very gently touched the blue ribbon still tied around its wrist, a reminder of their time together. Eleanor understood the gesture. Friend was saying it had never forgotten her, would never forget her. She wished desperately that she could explain everything to Friend, could tell it about the legal battles and the fight to expose Apache, but she settled for pressing her hand against Friend's massive palm, trying to convey through touch what she couldn't say with words. Margaret had regained her composure and was gathering up the supplies with new urgency. "Eleanor, we need to leave now while Apache and his friends are still panicking. This is our chance to get this evidence back to town." Eleanor nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart rebelled against leaving Friend again so soon after their reunion. "Will I see you again?" she asked Friend, knowing the question was futile. Friend made a sound that might have been affirmation or might have been farewell, and then it turned and disappeared back into the forest, moving with such grace and speed that within seconds it was as if the creature had never been there at all. Eleanor and Margaret made the journey back to town in record time, driven by urgency and the knowledge that Apache would be trying to undermine their evidence even as they traveled. When they arrived, they went immediately to Reverend Hallowell's house, demanding an emergency meeting of the community leaders. Within hours, the same church that had hosted the divisive meeting was filled again, but this time Eleanor had evidence to support her claims. She laid out the supplies they'd found, explaining in detail what each item proved about Apache's intentions. "These supplies were hidden in the clearing where Apache claims we camped for a day hunt," Eleanor explained, her voice clear and strong. "They include enough food for a week-long journey, extra blankets, rope, weapons, everything a man would need for a solo trip back to civilization. If Apache truly believed we'd both be returning together, why would he leave all this behind?" She gestured to the items spread across the table. "The answer is simple. He never planned for me to return. He packed these supplies for himself, for his journey back alone, after abandoning me to die. Apache, who had been forced to attend the meeting, stood and tried to maintain his composure, despite still looking shaken from his encounter with Friend. This proves nothing, he insisted. Eleanor could have planted those supplies herself, could have hidden them months ago to support her false narrative. And even if they were mine, there could be innocent explanations. Perhaps I planned to return to that clearing later for an extended hunt, but his voice lacked its usual conviction, and Eleanor could see people in the audience exchanging meaningful glances. Thomas stood then, his old frame straight and dignified. "I have something to add," he said. "The day before they left, Apache came to my trading post and purchased supplies, the exact items Eleanor has shown us tonight. He specifically told me they were for a solo expedition he planned after a short hunt with his wife. At the time I thought nothing of it, but now I see it was part of his plan. He was preparing to abandon Eleanor and needed supplies for his return journey." The room erupted in whispers, and Apache's face flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. "And there's one more thing," Eleanor said, deciding to reveal her final piece of evidence even though it would sound unbelievable. "When Margaret and I went to retrieve these supplies, Apache followed us. He brought 2 companions and they found us at the clearing. But before they could interfere, we were protected by the creature that saved my life last November." She spoke carefully, knowing how her next words would sound. "The creature that locals call Bigfoot, that the native tribes have stories about. It's real, and it saved my life when my husband left me to die." The room exploded in chaos, with people shouting denials and accusations. Apache laughed harshly. "Now we see the full extent of her delusions. She's claiming mythical monsters came to her rescue. This is exactly what I've been saying. Eleanor needs medical help, not legal proceedings. But one of the men who had accompanied Apache to the clearing stood up, his face pale. "It's true," he said quietly. "I saw it. We all saw it. There's something in those mountains, something large and powerful that we can't explain. It came out of the forest and we ran." "Apache, you saw it too. Tell them the truth." Apache's face went through a series of expressions, denial, fear, calculation, before he finally spoke. "I saw something, but it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs. The light was dim, we were startled. Eleanor's interpretation of events is colored by her disturbed mental state, but the damage was done. People could see Apache struggling, could see the fear in his eyes when the creature was mentioned, could see that Eleanor's impossible story might somehow be true. And if that impossible part was true, what did that say about the rest of her accusations?" Reverend Hallowell called for order, and when the room finally quieted, addressed the assembly with a troubled expression. "These are extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. But I must say, the physical evidence Eleanor has presented, combined with Thomas's testimony about the supplies purchased, paints a troubling picture. Apache, can you explain why you would purchase supplies for a week-long solo journey the day before taking your wife on what you claimed would be a day hunt?" Apache's jaw worked, but no convincing explanation emerged. The Reverend continued, "Furthermore, the fact that Eleanor survived for months in the wilderness and returned with new skills and knowledge suggests her story about having help, regardless of the source, may have merit. A woman with no survival training doesn't simply live through a mountain winter without assistance." He turned to Apache, with disappointment clear on his face. "I believe Eleanor's account has enough supporting evidence that we cannot simply dismiss it as the ravings of an unstable mind. At minimum, you owe this community and your wife an honest accounting of what happened on that hunting trip." For a long moment, Apache said nothing, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Eleanor could see him calculating, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage his position. But the truth was written in his eyes, in his body language, in the way he couldn't meet anyone's gaze directly. Finally, something in him seemed to break. "Fine," he said, his voice bitter. "You want the truth?" "Yes, I left her there. I left Eleanor in the forest because I couldn't stand being married to her anymore. Couldn't stand her constant questions and her neediness. I had a chance at a better life, a wealthier wife, and Eleanor was in the way." The church went silent, everyone stunned to hear Apache actually confess. Eleanor felt vindicated and heartbroken in equal measure. Vindicated that people would finally believe her. Heartbroken that the man she'd once loved could admit so callously to trying to murder her. "I didn't think she'd survive," Apache continued, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "I thought nature would take its course and I'd be free. But she did survive, and now she's ruined everything I worked for. Are you happy now, Eleanor? You've destroyed me just as thoroughly as I tried to destroy you." "I didn't destroy you," Eleanor said quietly. "You destroyed yourself the moment you decided my life was worth less than your ambitions. I just made sure everyone knew the truth." She turned to Reverend Hallowell. "I want a divorce. I want to be legally free of this man and any claim he has on me. And I want him held accountable for what he did. Though I know in 1842, attempting to murder your wife isn't considered as serious a crime as it should be." Reverend Hallowell nodded gravely. "Apache Blackwood, you are hereby expelled from this church and this community. Your actions are not only criminal, but morally reprehensible. I will support Eleanor's petition for divorce and will testify to your confession if legal proceedings follow. You have 24 hours to collect your belongings and leave this settlement. If you're found here after that time, you'll be forcibly removed." He looked at the assembled community. "Let this be a lesson to all of us about the danger of judging by appearances, of assuming charm equals character." Apache stood, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. He looked at Eleanor with pure hatred. "You've won," he spat. "But don't think this is over. Don't think I'll just disappear quietly. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, no longer afraid of him. I survived months in the wilderness, Apache. I learned to face down predators far more dangerous than you. Your threats don't frighten me anymore. She paused, then added softly, and I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred would make me like you, and I refuse to let what you did turn me into something ugly. The words seemed to hit Apache harder than any accusation or threat could have. He stared at her for a moment, something complicated passing across his face. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of what he'd thrown away. Then he turned and walked out of the church, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Eleanor watched him go, feeling a complicated mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been closure. That chapter of her life was ending, and while it had been written in betrayal and pain, she'd survived it and emerged stronger. In the weeks that followed, the settlement buzzed with the scandal of what had happened. Apache left as ordered, reportedly heading east where his reputation hadn't preceded him. Eleanor stayed with Margaret, and the two women formed a partnership that went beyond friendship. Margaret, who had been widowed and knew the challenges of a woman alone in frontier society, taught Eleanor how to manage property and finances. Eleanor, with her hard-won wilderness skills, taught Margaret how to be more self-sufficient. They became a formidable team, two women who'd nearly been victimized by the same man, but had instead found strength in each other. The divorce was granted within months, unusual for the time, but made possible by Apache's public confession and the church's support of Eleanor's case. She reclaimed her maiden name, Eleanor Winters, feeling like she was reclaiming herself in the process. She bought a small piece of land adjacent to Margaret's property, building a modest cabin, with help from community members who had come to respect her resilience. She made a living by offering her wilderness skills to others, teaching hunting and tracking, preparing medicinal herbs, guiding hunting parties through the mountains. But Eleanor never forgot Friend, and she often made trips into the high mountains, ostensibly to gather herbs, but really hoping for another glimpse of the creature that had saved her life. She left gifts at the cave where they'd lived together, dried fruits, strips of smoked meat, small tokens of gratitude and remembrance. Sometimes the gifts would be gone when she returned, and sometimes she'd find evidence that the cave had been recently occupied. A fire carefully banked, fresh moss spread on the sleeping area. She never saw Friend on these trips, but she felt its presence, felt watched over and protected even when she couldn't see her unlikely guardian. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after her return to civilization, Eleanor was gathering wild herbs on a mountainside when she heard a familiar sound, that low, rumbling call that had become so dear to her. She turned and saw Friend standing at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden in shadow. Eleanor's heart leaped with joy, and she walked toward the creature slowly, not wanting to startle it. Friend stepped into the sunlight, and Eleanor saw something that made her gasp. Friend wasn't alone. Behind the larger creature was a smaller one, clearly young, watching Eleanor with curious eyes. "You have a family," Eleanor whispered, overcome with emotion. Friend made a gentle sound and urged the young one forward. The smaller creature approached cautiously, and Eleanor knelt down to make herself less intimidating. The young one reached out and touched Eleanor's face with one small hand, and Eleanor laughed through her tears. Friend was sharing its family with her, including her in something precious and private. They spent the afternoon together, the three of them, with Friend showing the young one how to identify edible plants, while Eleanor watched, marveling at the trust being extended to her. As the sun began to set and it was time to part ways, Eleanor hugged Friend gently, pressing her face against its fur and breathing in the familiar scent of pine and earth. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving my life, for teaching me to be strong, for showing me that family isn't just about blood or marriage, but about who shows up when you need them most. I'll never forget you, Friend. Never." Friend made a sound that Eleanor had come to recognize as contentment and gently touched the blue ribbon still tied around its wrist. Then friend and the young one disappeared into the forest, leaving Eleanor standing in the fading light with a heart full of bittersweet joy. Eleanor returned to her cabin as darkness fell, finding Margaret waiting on the porch with hot tea and worried concern. "I was about to send a search party," Margaret scolded gently. "You were gone longer than usual." Eleanor smiled and sat beside her friend, accepting the tea gratefully. "I had a reunion with an old friend," she explained. "And I learned something important today. I learned that love and family come in the most unexpected forms, and that the monsters in our lives are rarely the ones we expect." She told Margaret about seeing Friend and the young one, about the afternoon spent in quiet companionship with creatures that shouldn't exist, but did. Margaret listened without judgment, having learned to trust Eleanor's experiences even when they defied explanation. "You're at peace," Margaret observed. "I can see it in your face. You finally let go of what Apache did to you." Eleanor considered this and nodded slowly. "I have, because I realized that Apache took months of my life, but Friend gave me back my whole self. Apache tried to make me weak and dependent, but Friend taught me to be strong and self-sufficient. In trying to destroy me, Apache actually set me free to become someone I never could have been in that marriage." The years passed, and Eleanor built a life that was rich in ways she'd never imagined in her youth. She never remarried, having learned that she didn't need a husband to be complete or valued. She and Margaret became pillars of their community, known for their strength, wisdom and willingness to help other women facing difficult circumstances. Eleanor occasionally heard news of Apache. He'd remarried in a different territory, apparently unable to learn from his mistakes, and was rumored to be just as cruel to his new wife as he'd been to Eleanor. She felt sorrow for the unknown woman, but knew she couldn't save everyone. Could only live her own life with integrity and hope that others would find their own paths to freedom. Eleanor continued her trips into the mountains throughout the years, and occasionally she'd catch glimpses of Friend, watching over her from a distance. The blue ribbon remained tied around Friend's wrist, faded by sun and rain, but never removed, a symbol of a bond that transcended species and circumstance. And sometimes, late at night, when Eleanor sat by her fire and thought about her life's strange turns, she'd marvel at the truth she'd learned in that forest, that humanity isn't defined by walking on two legs or speaking with words, but by acts of kindness, by choosing to help when you could ignore, by protecting the vulnerable when it would be easier to walk away. On her deathbed many years later, surrounded by the chosen family she'd built through friendship and shared struggle, Eleanor's last words were about Friend. "Tell them," she whispered to Margaret, who held her hand as she had so many times before. "Tell them that monsters aren't what we think they are. The real monsters walk among us wearing human faces, charming and cruel. And the real heroes sometimes live in shadows, misunderstood and feared, but possessing more humanity than those who would hunt them," Margaret promised, tears streaming down her aged face. And when Eleanor closed her eyes for the last time, she was smiling, at peace with a life that had been hard-won, but ultimately triumphant. In the mountains above the settlement, a massive figure stood on a ridge, looking down at the lights of the town where Eleanor had lived. Around its wrist, barely visible in the starlight, was a faded blue ribbon, preserved through decades with gentle care. The creature made a low, mournful sound, a goodbye to a friend who had taught it that humans weren't all cruel, that some possessed courage and kindness that transcended their physical frailty. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest it had always called home, carrying with it the memory of a woman who had been abandoned to die, but had chosen instead to live, to thrive, to prove that strength comes not from never falling, but from rising every time you're knocked down.